I've spent an unhealthy amount of time thinking about Articuno and the massive divide between its use in singles and VGC, the official format which plays exclusively doubles battles with a unique set of restrictions.
It's a double knockout onto the Landers and the Rilla Boom. Articuno sitting pretty on the field, and just like that, Nickel has evened up the score. It's 2 Pokemon apiece.
Articuno was recently on a winning team in a special event tournament. Meanwhile, it's in the very bottom tier of play in singles, which just voted to ban a baby Pokemon for being too strong. Watch my last video for more on that. This big win was the hot topic on the block around VGC players for a little while, but I found that nobody was actually talking about Articuno in singles and if it had been overlooked or why it's so bad. And so, while this video will primarily be about Articuno in singles, I apologize for the fact that I will go over quite a few of the reasons why Articuno is better in VGC to provide context. A Pokemon being vastly different between the two formats is usual, as you probably heard people talk about Incineroar being one of the strongest Pokemon to ever grace VGC. Meanwhile, in singles, it currently resides in NU, which is one of the lower tiers standing for never used. Having a big gap between the power level of Pokemon in singles and VGC is not inherently noteworthy. That said, this is not only the biggest gap possible, but Articuno is a generally gimmickless Pokemon, lacking in any super unique or standout features like Murkrow's Prankster Tailwind. And so I think it's worth exploring why Articuno is absolutely garbage in singles, but is good in VGC. Usually when a Pokemon is far better in VGC, it primarily has to do with abilities like Intimidate, which have their effects doubled in double battles as it affects both of the enemies. Articuno's abilities technically get boosted in doubles, but not really. Rather, Articuno's in singles use Pressure, while Articuno's in VGC use Snow Cloak. Pressure is a nice yet not exceedingly useful ability where it causes enemies to use 2 power points every time they use their moves instead of 1. Meanwhile, Snow Cloak will decrease the accuracy of moves used against Articuno by 20% while the snow is active. Snow Cloak is actually banned from singles formats, not necessarily because it's overpowered, but singles formats will outright ban most anything that decreases accuracy or increases evasion. Naturally, this means that in VGC, Articuno is being used on snow teams paired with Alolan Ninetales to set up the snow upon entry. And in case you weren't aware, snow is different from the old weather condition known as hail that existed before Gen 9. Where hail passively did damage to non-ice types, snow will simply increase the defense of ice types by 50%. So when snow is active, Articuno becomes deceptively tanky as it already has good special defense, its regular defense is boosted by snow, and it will dodge 20% of moves. This buff is further increased by Alolan Ninetales using Aurora Veil, which is Light Screen and Reflect packed into one move, halving all incoming damage to your team for up to 8 turns if your Ninetales is holding the item Light Clay. All of this turns the usually non-threatening Articuno into a veritable tank. But it's not just defensively where Articuno improves. Articuno's main source of damage comes from the extremely powerful move Blizzard. Blizzard's base power is 110, which is 10 less than it used to be in generations 1 through 5, but it's still significantly more powerful than the majority of moves that have no drawback, and it hits both opponents with a 10% chance to inflict the deadly Freeze status. Freeze is indefinite, and unless the enemy has a move like Flare Blitz, then they cannot thaw out unless they get lucky and roll a 1 out of 5. And because you're using Alolan Ninetales to set the weather, there's a good chance that you're actually going to be using Blizzard during the snow, so it'll never miss. There is a bit of a drawback though, because moves like Icy Wind and Blizzard, which hit both targets in a double battle, actually have their power decreased by 25% to balance the benefit of doubling the potential damage output. This means that spread moves effectively are at 150% of their power in doubles, which is a significant buff, but also a complex one which favors moves with powerful secondary effects because single target moves will more often hit the intended target, which they deal more overall damage to. That was a bit of a funky sentence, so I'll use an example. In a double battle, a blank set Articuno will always fail to KO a Meowscarada, but even the ordinarily weaker Ice Beam actually has a chance to KO. And the ability to KO a Pokemon is usually much more valuable than dealing, say, an extra 30% damage on a tertiary Flutter Mane. Hence why single target moves like Ice Beam are still commonly used on Pokemon that have moves like Blizzard or Icy Wind. The last big move difference is actually Sheer Cold. Sheer Cold always one-shots non-ice type opponents, but only hits 30% of the time when used against opponents of the same level. Sheer Cold isn't any different in VGC, in fact it's arguably worse, it's just that one-hit KO moves are banned as a rule in Smogon singles formats. Meanwhile in VGC they're legal, much to the chagrin of some top players.
If you want to use Fissure,
your life is nothing!
Oko moves aren't particularly good, but for a Pokemon like Articuno, they're perfect. In singles, Articuno tends to struggle the most due to its limited moveset. It has the awesome yet unreliable Blizzard and Hurricane, or the decently powerful Ice Beam and Air Slash. But as far as coverage moves go, it has nothing. This moveset slugs ball. If Iron Bundle has proven anything, a water move paired with Freeze Dry is more than enough coverage to be meta. Articuno's best water move is Water Pulse, so that's not an option. Bolt Beam is also a famous combination of Ice and Electric, which hits nearly every Pokemon for at least neutral damage, and of course Articuno has no electric moves. There's nothing else even decent, as the strongest non-normal or stab move that Articuno learns is U-Turn. Articuno gets walled hard by Steel types. Sheer Cold is needed on Articuno for coverage purposes somehow. However, the biggest reason for the change in Articuno's viability has nothing to do with what Articuno can and can't do. Rather, it has to do with one of the strongest moves ever made, Stealth Rocks. Stealth Rocks is on every singles team pretty much ever because it deals 12.5% damage multiplied by the Pokemon's weakness or resistance to rock-type moves to any Pokemon when they switch in for the rest of the game unless you remove it via something like Rapid Spin or Defog. This is not typically used in VGC because you only play with 4 Pokemon and it's a doubles battle, so 2 of them start on the field, so there's not a lot of switching that goes on. That's not to say it never gets used, it's just not very common. But in singles, it means that Articuno absolutely needs to hold the item Heavy Duty Boots or will take 50% damage upon swapping in because Ice Flying is double weak to Stealth Rocks, and Stealth Rocks are a real they're a real slug of a birch. In order to properly research Articuno in the current landscape of Gen 9, I threw together a snow team entirely of my own machinations for the ZU ladder. It sucked, and even after a decent bit of tuning, it still sucked, even for ZU, but I was at least able to get to top 500 on the ladder in fairly decent time nonetheless. That's not exactly a big accomplishment in this trash can tier, which is unofficial that not a lot of people are playing, but it is enough for me. In order to assess the team outside of the ZU meta, I also played against Chili Single Strike in a gauntlet where he started with an Ubers team and went down a tier every time I lost, eventually resulting in me winning against an RU team, but I have a striking suspicion that Chili was going easy on me, and he didn't have any experience with some of the teams he was playing against me. The biggest issue with the team is, no shocker, Articuno. Actually, never mind, no, it was a bit of a shocker. I was using Magcargo as a joke, and Magcargo was doing better. While in the past, Articuno had access to useful utility moves like Defog, Heal Bell, and Toxic, and was still ZU, Articuno in Gen 9 has almost nothing support-wise. Smogon suggests a defensive pivot, but that makes no sense on my team because a bulky Articuno ironically exerts no pressure. And pivoting is just kind of hard to make use of on a team where a lot of your Pokemon share the same weaknesses. The one major benefit to a slow pivot is that you can safely maneuver into a Pokemon that has a good setup move or threatens to deal a lot of damage right off the bat, but my Pokemon that does that is Beartic, which really likes to do it when Snow is active because it has the ability Slush Rush, doubling its speed, and it also wanted to have Aurora Veil up so it could safely guarantee 1 or even 2 Swords Dances, but those are both things that have time limits, so I can't waste a turn trying to pivot, and it's not even a very good pivot because any Pokemon that counters Articuno probably also counters Beartic. After I felt like recording for this video was over, I actually tried using a different team, which wasn't going so well until I introduced Articuno as a specially defensive pivot, and within a day of playing using it, I was able to get up to top 300. Which goes to show that the Smogon analysis isn't bunk, it just didn't really work for snow teams. But outside the context of snow teams, I don't see Articuno competing for the spot of a tanky pivot on higher tiers. Defensive pivots usually like to threaten statuses, but Articuno has no status moves. A good example of a better defensive pivot is Moltres. Despite sharing the same 4x weakness to Stealth Rocks, Moltres can easily switch into contact moves and threaten to burn the opponent thanks to Flame Body, and if the opponent isn't using a contact move, then it can manually proc the burn using Will-O-Wisp. Thematically, Zapdos is also often used as a defensive pivot, and it too is just way better than Articuno, partially because it's a much better type, but also because it can just actually threaten status and deal damage. And so, for many games I actually tried using Articuno as a speedy attacker, both the physical attacking set and sometimes using the higher risk, higher reward special attacking set. And just because I feel the need to clarify, because I know that somebody would otherwise comment about this, Hurricane and Blizzard will have their accuracies reduced in harsh sunlight, but they are not reduced in other weather effects. Common misconception, don't worry, when I miss Hurricane, it's not because I'm bad, it's just because I'm stupid. Wait. Anyway, I ended up liking the physical set a lot more just because of its sheer reliability. I was getting a lot more consistent damage from U-turn, and I didn't have to worry about missing a Brave Bird.
Dodge this!
The special attacking set did prove itself as the way to go, but this mostly had to do with the fact that I lacked a good special attacker. Meanwhile, on the physical attacking side, I had Beartic. Beartic is just as strong as Garchomp, and in snow is faster and more defensively tanky than Garchomp. Because Light Clay is banned by RU, lower tiers cannot use it, and so my Abomasnow was left with Icy Rock to extend the snow for 8 turns. After one Swords Dance, my Beartic was consistently able to go on a tear and rip through whatever enemy team I was up against. That thing is a low tier legend. It was very fun to play with and easily was the cause of me winning most of my games. Ultimately, I only saw one other person using an Articuno, and it wasn't on a snow team. I felt that if I could replace one Pokemon on my team, Articuno would be it, which is again an insane statement given that I have a Macargo. One thing that I tried to consider is if Articuno would be better in these situations if it had Snow Cloak and if Light Clay was unbanned, and the answer that I came to was, sadly, not really. Articuno just has no serious use in a singles format without a more dynamic move pool. While it can keep its head above water in the kiddie pool that is ZU, its power is almost entirely coming from its high base stat total, which isn't incredibly high, nor are its stats particularly well distributed. Even in its own tier, I'm really not sure if it's any better than Rotom Frost, which has way better coverage moves, a single extra point of speed allowing it to actually beat Articuno, and a better type combination with a more useful ability, as well as status moves. And so VGC really is the perfect format for Articuno, though I think the most recent VGC results tell a strange story. Both Articuno and Alolan Ninetales are hard countered by Steel and Fire types, which makes running the pair a hard needle to thread. In the tournament that Nikhil Reddy won with Articuno and Ninetales, he comboed them with Hisuian Arcanine and Landorus Incarnate, who both have super effective stab moves versus Steel and Fire. Ultimately, the tourney was so unfavorable to Steel types, there was but one Golden Go representing the type in the top 10 teams. In the more recent Vancouver Regional, Kangambit and Golden Go were less popular but performed way better alongside Iron Crown, and the highest placing Articuno team was 39th, which is a far cry from the prior two tournaments where Articuno was able to place 3rd and 1st. And you'd think that coming hot off the heels of those past two tournaments, a lot of people would be picking up this strategy, but that's not the case in the slightest. By looking at the Nimbasa City Post team breakdowns, we can see that only 4 players out of 160 used the duo in the following tournaments after Nikhil Reddy's first place run in a tournament with 256 contenders. And if I had to guess why, it's probably because a lot of players are afraid to switch to a team that has 2 or 3 Pokemon that they likely have no experience with at all, as Hisuian Arcanine isn't particularly popular right now. All in all, the team forgoes 8 out of the top 10 most popular Pokemon in the format. So what do you think? Is this the secret formula to success in VGC, or is it a flash in the pan fueled by a maelstrom of perfect conditions? One thing's for sure, Terra Fire, Max Attack Weakness Policy, Magcargo, Lava Plume 100% chance to KO both Landorus and Articuno.